At 88 years old, country music icon Bill Anderson has finally broken his silence, and what he revealed about the late Jimmy Capps is something fans were never prepared for. This is not just another country music memory. It is a hidden story from deep inside the Grand Ole Opry, a story that remained untold for decades. Behind the stage lights, the applause, and the timeless songs, there was a friendship that quietly shaped country music history in ways most people never realized. But what really happened between these two legends? And why did Bill Anderson wait so long to finally speak about it? There's one part of this story he still seems careful around, one detail left hanging between the lines. And once you hear it, you may never listen to their music the same way again. To understand why Bill Anderson's words carry so much weight, you first have to understand the life he lived. Bill was born in Columbia, South Carolina, and raised around Atlanta, Georgia. Long before he became a country music legend, he was simply a college student studying journalism at the University of Georgia. To help pay his bills, he worked as a radio DJ. But while juggling classes and late-night radio shifts, he wrote a little honky-tonk song called City Lights. He was only 19 years old. That one song changed everything. The song landed in the hands of Ray Price, who recorded it in 1958. The record exploded and shot straight to #1 on the country charts. Almost overnight, a young kid from Georgia became one of the hottest names in Nashville. Record labels came calling immediately. Bill signed with Decca Records, and just a few years later, in 1961, the Grand Ole Opry invited him to join its cast. He was only 23 years old. And that was only the beginning. Over the decades, Bill Anderson stacked up 37 top 10 country hits. He wrote songs that later became massive successes for artists like George Strait, Brad Paisley, and Vince Gill. Fans nicknamed him Whisperin' Bill because of his soft, breathy, conversational singing style. Nobody sounded quite like him. But here's what made Bill different from many stars of his era. He never seemed obsessed with fame. He cared about the songs, the emotion, the people behind the music. And maybe that's exactly why he connected so deeply with Jimmy Capps. In 2001, Bill Anderson was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. A year later, BMI named him the very first country music songwriting icon in history, placing him alongside names like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Bo Diddley. Some of his songs even ended up preserved in the Library of Congress beside works from George Gershwin, Bob Dylan, and Hank Williams. He has spent more than 64 years as a member of the Grand Ole Opry, longer than any current member alive today. So when someone like Bill Anderson speaks emotionally about another musician, people stop and listen. Because Bill did not witness country music history from a distance. He lived inside it. And now, at 88 years old, he is finally sharing what Jimmy Capps truly meant to the people around him. But to understand that, we need to go back to where Jimmy's story first began. Jimmy Capps was born on May 25, 1939, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and raised in the small nearby town of Benson. His parents, Tommy and Alice Capps, raised him in a modest home. Nothing about his childhood suggested he would one day become one of the most respected guitarists in country music history. But from the very beginning, Jimmy was drawn to music like it was calling him. At 12 years old, he picked up a guitar. Nobody forced him to practice. Nobody pushed him toward music. He simply heard something in those strings that connected directly to his soul. And once he started playing, he never stopped. By the time he reached his teenage years, Jimmy was already turning heads. Not just because he was talented, but because his playing had something special that experienced musicians immediately recognized. People would stop what they were doing just to listen. Then, at only 19 years old, Jimmy got the opportunity that changed his life forever. He auditioned for the legendary Louvin brothers. At the time, Charlie Louvin and Ira Louvin were among the most respected acts in all of country music. Their harmonies were unforgettable. Their gospel-influenced sound had earned them enormous respect across Nashville. And after hearing Jimmy play, Charlie Louvin personally invited him to join the band. Jimmy would later say that moment gave him his entire career. Then came December 1958. Just months after his audition, 19-year-old Jimmy Capps stood on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry for the very first time, playing guitar alongside the Louvin brothers during Knoxville Girl. Imagine the pressure of that moment. A teenager from a tiny North Carolina town standing on the biggest stage in country music. Most people would have been terrified. But Jimmy belonged there. And from that night forward, he never truly left. By 1967, Jimmy officially joined the Grand Ole Opry house band, becoming one of the central figures in Nashville's recording scene. At the height of his career, he played on more than 500 recording sessions every single year. Think about that for a moment. 500 sessions. That means he was recording almost every day, sometimes multiple times in one day. And the songs that came from those sessions became legendary. Jimmy played guitar on Stand By Your Man by Tammy Wynette. He played on He Stopped Loving Her Today by George Jones, a song many still consider the greatest country recording ever made. His guitar can also be heard on The Gambler by Kenny Rogers, Elvira by the Oak Ridge Boys, I Was Country When Country Wasn't Cool by Barbara Mandrell, Amarillo by Morning by George Strait, How Blue by Reba McEntire, Here in the Real World by Alan Jackson, and The Rose by Conway Twitty. The list keeps going until it almost feels impossible. But what made Jimmy Capps truly different was not just his talent. It was his humility. Despite helping create some of the biggest country songs ever recorded, Jimmy never pushed himself into the spotlight. He never demanded attention. He never bragged about his accomplishments. He simply showed up, played beautifully, and went home. That quiet humility left a deep impression on everyone around him. Brad Paisley once talked about the strange feeling of performing at the Grand Ole Opry and suddenly realizing the quiet man playing guitar behind him was the same musician who had played on Stand By Your Man, He Stopped Loving Her Today, and Amarillo by Morning. The same hands. The same calm presence. One man connected to decades of country music history. Jimmy even described himself as the man in back. That phrase became the title of his autobiography. And honestly, it perfectly captured who he was. He believed his job was to support the song and lift the artist, not draw attention to himself. That kind of humility is rare in any profession. In country music, it is almost unheard of. And this is where Bill Anderson's story becomes deeply emotional. For decades, Bill and Jimmy worked side by side. Jimmy regularly played in Bill's Po Folks band. They traveled together, performed together, recorded together, and spent countless hours backstage at the Grand Ole Opry. Jimmy also appeared regularly on Country's Family Reunion, the beloved RFD TV show Bill hosted for more than 23 years. Bill knew Jimmy not just as a musician, but as a human being. And now, at 88 years old, Bill is finally speaking with a level of honesty that only comes from carrying something in your heart for a very long time. According to Bill, Jimmy Capps was the emotional anchor of every room he entered. Not because he demanded attention. Not because he was loud. But because of the way he treated people. When recording sessions became stressful and tempers flared, Jimmy stayed calm. When nervous young artists felt overwhelmed backstage at the Opry, Jimmy quietly encouraged them. When road-weary musicians felt exhausted after years of touring, Jimmy somehow made them feel important again. He treated superstars and newcomers exactly the same way. Everyone received the same kindness, the same patience, the same quiet encouragement. But here's the part Bill Anderson struggled most to talk about. Jimmy spent much of his life carrying the emotional weight of other people while hiding his own struggles behind a smile. He became the support system for countless musicians, friends, and performers. Yet he rarely allowed others to see when he himself was hurting. According to Bill, Jimmy's instinct was always to lift others first, even when he was carrying pain of his own. And suddenly, the story becomes much deeper than music. Bill Anderson has written songs about loneliness and heartbreak for most of his life. He understands emotions most people struggle to explain. And according to Bill, the loneliness musicians experience behind the scenes is something fans rarely get to see. The crowds disappear. The applause fades. But the emotional weight often remains. Jimmy Capps quietly carried that weight for decades. And somehow, while carrying his own burdens, he still spent his life helping everyone else feel stronger. That is not simply the story of a great guitarist. That is the story of a truly rare human being. There's another side of Jimmy's career that many fans never hear about. He wasn't only a performer. He also became a respected producer. He worked closely with Charlie Louvin, the very man who first gave him a chance. He also produced recordings for Jan Howard and worked behind the scenes with the Wilburn brothers. And what that really shows is something simple but powerful. People trusted Jimmy. Not just with music, but with emotion, storytelling, and legacy. They trusted him to help shape the sound that represented their lives and careers. That trust says everything. Then came another emotional moment years after his death. In 2024, A section of Interstate 40 in North Carolina was officially named after Jimmy Capps. 4 years after he passed away, his home state honored him with a highway carrying his name. And somehow, there's something deeply poetic about that image. A road stretching across the state where he was born. A road carrying the name of a man who spent most of his life helping others reach their dreams while staying quietly in the background himself. Jimmy Capps also achieved something at the Grand Ole Opry that may never be repeated. He served as lead guitarist in the Opry House Band for more than 61 years, longer than any musician in the history of the program. Think about how much country music changed during those decades. Artists came and went. Trends shifted. Entire generations passed through Nashville. But Jimmy remained. Steady. Reliable. Quietly shaping the sound of country music from behind the scenes. In 2018, the Grand Ole Opry honored him in a deeply personal way by renaming its rehearsal space the Jimmy Capps Music Room. It wasn't just another award. It felt like the building itself permanently made room for the man who helped define its sound for generations. Other country legends spoke about Jimmy with enormous respect. Ricky Skaggs described him as a remarkable figure in Nashville music history. Crystal Gayle remembered his humility even after becoming a legend. Charlie Pride called him a prose pro, someone who lifted every performance simply by being there. And these weren't empty compliments. These were words from people who had worked beside him for years and truly understood what he brought into every room. When Jimmy Capps passed away on June 1, 2020, at 81 years old, country music did not simply lose a guitarist. It lost one of its quiet foundations. And only after he was gone did many people fully realize how much of the music they loved had been shaped by a man they barely knew by name. Maybe that's why Bill Anderson finally chose to speak now. Because both men came from the same era. Neither built a career around fame or attention. Bill expressed himself through lyrics. Jimmy expressed himself through guitar strings. But both understood something modern fame often forgets. The music mattered more than the spotlight. The songs mattered more than ego. And perhaps that is the real reason Bill's words feel so emotional today. He isn't simply remembering an old friend. He's making sure the world never forgets the quiet man standing in the background of country music history, holding so much of it together without ever asking for recognition. A man named Jimmy Capps. Not from distance, but from years of being in the same rooms, on the same stages, and around. The same people who built that sound together. What often gets missed is that behind some of the most important recordings in country music history were people like Jimmy Capps, who simply kept showing up and doing the work without needing attention for it. Country music has always been built on real stories, real people, and real emotion. Behind those timeless songs stood quiet figures like Jimmy Capps, who gave everything to the music, without chasing fame. Now at 88, Bill Anderson is finally sharing his story. If you enjoyed this, share it with someone who loves classic country music. Drop your favorite Jimmy Capps moment in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.